I would like to introduce the moderator for the panel, Dr. David Adler, who is the director of the Andrus Center at Boise State University and a constitutional scholar. And Dr. Adler, turn it over to you to introduce the panel and conduct the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative Burgoyne. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you today to talk about the status of the Idaho Human Rights Act and the forthcoming proposals to amend the Act so as to provide protections against discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. I'll tell you, this panel could not have been brought together at a better time. The timing, in fact, is impeccable if you consider this. It was just yesterday that America began to celebrate the 100th birthday of Rosa Parks, that very courageous woman who refused to take a seat in the back of the bus and fought valiantly to preserve and to protect human dignity. And of course, her critical role in launching the civil rights movement changed the nature of America. And then some of you will remember that it was just a week ago that my center, the Andrus Center, featured a lecture from a Holocaust survivor. And that crowd, 1,000 strong, heard a very important message about the need to promote and to protect human dignity, to promote tolerance and diversity. And when you think about those two pillars of the effort to advance basic human rights, you recognize that we are together here today talking about an effort to further educate Idahoans on the need to provide constitutional protections for all Americans, for all Idahoans. So it's a great pleasure for me to serve as moderator. I'm joined by a very distinguished cast here today. You'll hear from each of our speakers in just a moment, but on my far left here is in fact Krause, who's the CEO of the Boise Valley Economic Partnership. And on his right is in fact John Reuter, who was the former president of the Sandpoint City Council, the first city in Idaho that you'll recall that passed the Anti-Discrimination Act. On my immediate left is Pam Park, who is in fact the executive director of the Idaho Commission on Human Rights. To my immediate right is the distinguished Idaho businessman Kevin Settles, and on his right is Reverend Marci Glass, who is pastor at the Southminster Presbyterian Church. And on our far right, no stranger to all of you here in Boise, is the president of the Boise City Council, Maryanne Jordan. Now, our time is limited strictly to 60 minutes today, and so there's not going to be time for Q&A. Those opportunities will come later as this campaign continues, this campaign of discussion and questions. But what I've asked our panelists to do here today is to take 3 or 4 minutes to talk about their interest in this particular subject and what brings them to the panel. So let's begin, first of all, with Clark Krause. Clark, please.
Thank you. I just have a few comments and then I'll give it to our much more qualified people in the panel. But my name is Clark Krause. I'm Executive Director for Boise Valley Economic Partnership. I've also done economic development in New Mexico, and I've done economic development in Utah. And we are responsible for the Idaho metropolitan area, so the Boise Valley, Treasure Valley, whichever words you like to use to describe this area. So the 10 cities that make up the valley is what we're responsible to, and we're funded by about 110 investors. And those investors are some of the large people you think about, Simplot, Micron, HP, but also people like Goodwood Barbecue and others. So from small to big businesses across this valley is who funds our drive to do the following: keep jobs here, grow jobs here, and bring jobs here. Does it sound like a pretty good role to have? I love my job. We recruit out of many states. We do these sales missions across the country. And I go into about 100 companies a year and meet with C-level executives to talk about the valley. And I also talk about Idaho a lot. And I also talk about Blue Fields a lot, that are, as you know, our football team. And what I hear more than often is one of their biggest questions to me is, how is it up there, and is there diversity? And how do you treat people? And that's a very important question, right? Not only for us, but for business. And as a community, some of the things that we want are the same things that people looking into this valley want. They want to encourage building business and opportunity here, and to truly provide that, you need infrastructure, you need commerce, you need safety, you need education, you need freedom, and most importantly, you need acceptance. So that people that are coming into the valley to do business here or grow businesses here feel safe here. From that comes creativity, comes entrepreneurs, it comes culture, it comes arts, all those things that we appreciate by living here. The freedom to do the things we want to do. And I'll just end with this. Discrimination is bad for business. Period. Thank you.
Thank you. John, please. I'm John Reuter, and I'm a former member, former city council president in Sandpoint, and I actually introduced our legislation up there. It's called the Non-Discrimination Ordinance, which at the time, the biggest question that we got around Sandpoint was, you know, why? So I'm somewhat used to answering that question. And one of the misconceptions was, frankly, that they thought people already thought there were state or federal protections, which there are not. And, that was obviously one of the first things was showing that need, and secondly was showing that there were people living in silent fear that could not speak out, and that's one of the most difficult problems right now in Idaho, is that the people who need the protection that this act would provide are often afraid to speak out because they don't have the protection that this act would provide. And I felt a special obligation as a white, straight, male Republican to say, hey, I'm in the middle of the mainstream of Idaho. You can't get any more in the middle of mainstream in Idaho than that, to say, you know what, this is all of our state, this is all of our city, and to stand up and say, you know, I don't have any fear of being discriminated against, and so I have the ability to step up and say, look, there are people who can't speak. So that was the motivation there, and that's part of why I want to join this panel today, was to share that I think action is possible in Idaho, and it's going to be bipartisan if it happens in Idaho, and I think it will happen. And I just want to note that it's already happening in a bipartisan way throughout the state. In our city council in Sandpoint, half the council was Republican, half the council is Democrat, officially nonpartisan, but people sort of get a sense of what the party breakdown is there, and we know each other, it's a small town. And we came together to say, this is the right thing for all of our citizens. This is the right thing for individual liberty, for people not to have to live in fear, for people to have a right to keep a job where they're doing everything right and not be discriminated against about something that has nothing to do with their job performance. That's just an innate part of who they are. And so that to me is what brings me to this issue, is that idea of individual liberty. And I just think it's really important to note that in places like Salt Lake City that beat all of us out here in Idaho, the LDS Church endorsed the ordinance. So this is not a partisan issue. This is not an issue that ought to be dividing Idaho the way that I think sometimes it has in our politics, although frankly, the people that this has always been the least controversial with are the people of Idaho, who I believe have always strongly, from rural places like Sandpoint to urban places like Boise, overwhelmingly supported these protections and believe that their fellow citizens should get the same rights that everyone else has. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Pam, please.
Hi, I'm Pam Parks, and I'm the administrator for the Idaho Human Rights Commission, and I've been asked here today to talk a little bit about a brief history of the Idaho Human Rights Act and how the Commission works within that structure. The Commission has been in existence for 44 years. 45 years ago, in 1968, after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Idaho misjudged how important his influence had been, even in our small state, and did not fly the flags half-staff from the time of his death to internment. As one thing leads to another, this led to one of the first civil rights protests on the State House steps, which in turn led to then Idaho Senator Phil Batt carrying legislation to create the Idaho Human Rights Act. And the Idaho legislature created the Idaho Human Rights Act in 1969, less than a year after the protest on the State House steps. As that legislative body envisioned it, the purpose of the act is to, quote, and I'm going to read to you, secure for all individuals within the state freedom from discrimination, and thereby to protect their interests in personal dignity, to make available to the state their full productive capacities, to secure the state against domestic strife and unrest, and to promote the interests, rights, and privileges of individuals within the state. End quote. The primary work of the Commission is to investigate claims of discrimination in employment, education, real estate transactions, and public accommodation based on race, sex, color, religion, and national origin. In employment, housing, and public accommodation, it handles disability claims and claims of age discrimination for those who are 40 or older. Those are processed only in employment cases. Through the administrative process, the Commission advises the parties on whether there is probable cause to believe that illegal discrimination has occurred. It is because of the Idaho Human Rights Act that Idaho is able to handle federal discrimination claims within the state. It's how we keep the federal government out and we're doing the work. It is a cornerstone of the work of the Commission to keep separate our enforcement role, and to that end, the Commission has always insisted that each and every case that is decided on its own facts and existing laws with no other considerations. So it creates a striking dichotomy that the Commission is also called upon to, quote, promote the interests, rights, and privileges of individuals within the state, end quote. It was with vision that the 1969 Idaho legislature included that language. It's language that assures us that Idaho is not static in a changing and dynamic world. For that reason, the act has been amended over the years, but the purpose remains the same. For example, in 1988, the statute was amended to add disability. In 1991, it was amended to cover employers with 5 or more employees. And in 2005, it was amended to add enforcement of disability accessibility in public accommodations. In addition, the Commission has supported many other pieces of legislation, including working hard to get the discriminatory language against the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints removed from the Idaho Constitution, the malicious harassment laws, and removal of the upper limit prohibiting discrimination based on age, just to name a few. In 2007, the Commissioners recognized that anti-gay discrimination was diminishing basic human rights, and it voted to support amending the Idaho Human Rights Act to add the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. The Commission continues to support this amendment to the Human Rights Act because the amendment holds fast to the statutory requirement to protect personal dignity, and it ensures that all people within the great state are able to enjoy the fundamental freedom to work, pray, live, and play free of discrimination.
Thank you very much, Pam. Please, Kevin.
Thank you, Dr. Adler. So, as he said, my name is Kevin Settles. I own the Bardenay Restaurants with locations here, Eagle, and out in Coeur d'Alene. I also need to add that I'm a brand new member of the Human Rights Commission, which is something that never occurred to me to even think about participating in. I was asked about 2 months ago if I would be interested. After talking to friends that were more familiar with the organization than I was, I agreed to do it. And I've been to one meeting, and I can tell you today that I will take away more from that than I will bring to the table. It will be very satisfying. I'm very pleased to be able to participate. It's a great group of people that you have there. And it kind of links back to why am I here? It's really, my parents taught me early on that what's important is if people are kind and caring, and there's nothing else that really makes any difference. How they look, what their race is, what their preference is for other things. So that's the way I was raised. I think my wife put it most succinctly, and this is maybe even a little bit blunt, but she said, based on her life experience, if she was to be prejudiced against anybody, based on the way they treated her, it would be straight white males. So that's from a personal side. From a business side, my restaurants are big places. They need to be busy. It takes a lot of people for us to turn a profit. It takes a lot of employees. And I've always been very active in governmental affairs, I guess. Things that I see a direct tie to my business. Beverage alcohol issues. The state healthcare exchange. Things like that. And a year ago, when I was watching and reading about this, add the words in the paper, and thought I'd keep my head down. And I was approached by an employee who asked me specifically to add the company name to the list. And I'm like, you know, it's a social issue. I like to avoid those things. I spent a night thinking about it, and our company has 3 operating principles. Number 1 is to provide a good place for your employees and to treat them with respect. Number 3 is to be a good neighbor. Well, to keep a place as busy as mine, as big as they are, it takes a lot of customers, and they're going to be diverse, and it takes a very big staff. And all I care about is that they're kind, efficient, care about their jobs, care about their customers. And so I really have to add my support to this, because our group is very diverse, and it's a large pool of people, and they deserve my respect and my help to make sure that they are able to lead a good life. So that's kind of how I came to this issue, and I'm glad to see it's back this year, and I hope that words are added.
Thank you, Kevin. Reverend Glass, please.
My name is Marci Glass. I'm service pastor of Southminster Presbyterian Church here in Boise, which is the church by the pedestrian overpass on Overland, if you're wondering where we are. My husband and sons and I moved here in 2008, and we enjoy being a part of this community and hope to be here for a long time. I never set out to be a campaigner for equal rights for people who are gay, lesbian, or transgender. It is not my personal experience or struggle, and yet here I am, and honored and proud to be here and thankful for the invitation today. Because until all of us are free, none of us are free. And I have become vocal in my support for equal rights, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity, as a pastoral response to the pain I have seen inflicted on members of my congregation and of people in the community. I know a young man who dropped out of high school in Meridian because he was bullied for being gay. I have met people who cannot get jobs because of their gender identity. I know couples who want to be joined in marriage but cannot because of their sexual orientation. In addition to the exclusion from this foundational way we as Americans have defined families, we take for granted, I think, as heterosexuals, what privileges we get with marriage. The ability to sit with our loved ones in the hospital as our partners are dying, for example, tax benefits, many others. I know many people who have been wounded because of their exclusion from family and faith communities and school. My call as minister of the good news of Jesus Christ is to proclaim justice to the oppressed and to stand with people as Christ would. Jesus offered radical hospitality, inviting all people, no exceptions, all people, to participate in the work of God's mercy and love. So it is my deep commitment to the God revealed in Scripture and to the teachings of Jesus that I am here today to speak for non-discrimination. While Scripture says very little about sexual orientation, it says quite a bit about justice and hospitality and about welcoming the stranger. My stance for non-discrimination is deeply rooted in the Word of God, a God who created each of us, all of us, in the very image of God and who declared that creation good. A God who became human and lived among us full of grace and truth, eating with outcasts, touching the unclean, and inviting all to join in the work of grace, mercy, and peace. And so that's why I'm here today.
Thank you, Reverend. And last but not least, Maryanne Jordan, please.
Thank you, David. I'm glad to see so many people here today, and really appreciate the continued work of Add the Words and the Pride Foundation and all of the organizations and individuals who continue to raise this issue at the state level, and I'm proud to play a small part in that and committed to continuing to raise this issue until these words are added to the human rights law in the state of Idaho. In the city of Boise, how we came to our non-discrimination ordinance was kind of an evolving exercise. We instituted a policy at the city about 7 years ago regarding our own employment practices that prohibited any discrimination according to sexual orientation or gender identity. And we did that for two reasons. We did that because we value our employees tremendously and felt that that was an important statement to make to them, but we also did that because, as Clark and Kevin have pointed out, it is simply good business. And, you know, we all know why we love living here in Boise and in Idaho. And it's just a given to us how much we love this place and how much we get from it. And because of that, we all give so much to our communities. But when you take a realistic look at the image of Idaho in the rest of the country, it's terrifying. And for those of us who are trying to build a better community, a more diverse community, a more economically stable community, there are days where we feel like we take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. And so anything that we can do to continue this conversation as a community, we need to all be committed to doing. In that vein, Councilmember Lauren McLean and I decided early on in the year to bring forward a non-discrimination ordinance for the city of Boise. My interest in that was piqued by a meeting that was requested of me with some constituents about 1.5 years ago who had been the victims of some gay bashing incidents in the downtown area. And they approached me about a meeting indicating that they had concerns about their police interaction. And I immediately became gravely concerned that perhaps the interaction was not respectful, was not kind, and they were not achieving the results when they were reporting these crimes. What I sadly came to learn was that they were not reporting these crimes. And the reason they were not reporting these crimes is because they feared that as these reports moved through the legal system, that they would be outed and consequently lose either their jobs or their housing as a result of having reported a crime on their person. And there is nothing more fundamental to an elected official when they take their oath of office than the health and safety of their constituents. And I don't care whether that's running a clean sewer system or making sure kids are vaccinated, whatever level of responsibility you have at your level of elected office, health and safety of your citizens is of primary concern. And when we don't provide these protections, the argument I hear all the time about not adding the words is that it will create a protective class. But what happens when you don't address these situations is that you create an unprotected class. You create a class of people who do not feel safe in their own community, who don't feel like if they are battered, that they can pick up the phone and call the police. For many of us, if we're victims of a crime, the first thing you do is dial 911. And it's hard to even conceptualize for me that I would stop and think about anything but calling 911. So that was the primary motivation for getting this ordinance going. We had remarkable support in this community. Clark Krause and the Chamber of Commerce, the only thing they said was, what do you need us to do and when do you need us to do it? They were on board unanimously. They understood the importance of this. The faith community rallied behind us in a tremendous way. And it was a broad spectrum of the faith community. It was people that you might not expect. And it made me check my own thinking in terms of what my impressions are of others and their beliefs. And it was validated in some wonderful ways. So, you know, I think that we at the City of Boise, I know myself personally, and my fellow council members and elected officials are quite committed to seeing our experience not as an end of a project, but as the beginning of something bigger for the state of Idaho. And we've had a lot of communications from other cities around the state, some that you might expect to hear from, some that were kind of a nice surprise. And I've arranged to do a panel at the Association of Idaho Cities Conference in June for any city who's interested in getting information on doing their own local ordinances. But for legislators that are in the room, I implore you to consider the fact that by not adding these words, you are leaving members of our society unprotected. And we have got to get everybody on the same page. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maryanne. On that last point, you noted that under our Constitution and legal system that effectively everybody is protected unless you're not. And so the failure to add the words creates an unprotected class. Do you suppose from your own experience here in leading the Boise City Council to enact the anti-discrimination measure that that is one key explanation for why cities around Idaho now, following the lead of Sandpoint, following Boise. Now we see that Ketchum has passed a similar measure. Idaho Falls, Pocatello, and Twin Falls are on the march to pass those measures. Do you think that's because your counterparts there recognize that if they don't pass that ordinance, then in effect they're leaving behind Americans and creating an unequal class?
I do. I think that's a part of it. I think it's also important to note that these ordinances apply to everyone in the community. I could be the victim of discrimination as a heterosexual woman just as easily as a lesbian woman could be the victim of discrimination if I were to apply for a job and be discriminated against for that reason. So it really is applying to everyone. I also think that cities are approaching this because they do know that if enough cities come together, this has happened on other issues. Texting and driving was one. The legislature wasn't quite sure which way to go for quite some time, and cities took up that issue one by one, and when the drumbeat got loud enough, they began to realize that it was time for some action on the state level. And I realize that's a bit of an odd comparison, but it's the process piece that I'm trying to get at with that. And so I think that cities are seeing that if they can all contribute to this conversation, that maybe that will be enough to show the legislature that there is, in fact, tremendous support statewide, across party lines, across business and religious lines in every corner of Idaho for this addition.
Now, both Kevin and Clark commented on the fact that passage of this proposed amendment would be good for business. Do you think that the passage of this measure would in fact become a very valuable recruiting tool?
Like I said, I meet with about 100 companies a year. We identify companies that are on the move, and then we go visit the decision makers. And, you know, they'll be very kind about it, but they'll always ask, what is Idaho like these days? And so we have to make sure that we ensure them that when they come in with their employees, people that will be running plants and providing jobs here, they want to make sure those people are safe here. They want to make sure those people can choose a religion, can choose the lifestyle, can choose all of those things. And so it's very heavy in their mind. You can imagine it's their family, right? They have to make sure that they're providing a place that makes sense for their company. And it is always a challenge to present to them diversity. But we will not go out necessarily and say, hey, we've just passed this ordinance, but they expect it. And if you don't have it, it certainly will kill the deal for you. So it's very critical that we do the right thing, as Kevin talked about earlier, and many of us have here. Business expects it, and business won't come if they don't have it, because they have to ensure that their employees and people that they're providing opportunity to and bringing huge investments here, that they're safe here, that there's safety here.
And Kevin, given your own experience as owner of Bardenay and your interactions with the people in the business community, do you find that the fact that an increasing number of businesses in Idaho are promoting non-discrimination practices represents a model for others to imitate?
You know, oddly enough, I think that when I look at my industry specifically, we realize that we have to be inclusive for everybody. And that's kind of where I see it. I don't see it much more than that, but it's more than just Idaho. It's nationwide, and we realize that if you're not all inclusive, then you're exclusive, and exclusive restaurants generally don't survive.
Good, simple point. John, let's go back to your point. I think you offered a compelling story as to your reasoning in promoting the anti-discrimination ordinance in Reuters. You found out that a number of people in your own city had been, in fact, the victims of crimes or mistreatment, but they couldn't come forward. And so they needed the protection of this anti-discrimination measure that your city passed. Do you find that that's probably the case in a number of cities around Idaho, which creates a compelling argument for other cities to embrace this kind of measure?
Let me tell you a story about that, and Maryanne certainly referenced that with people talking about it in Boise, and it was really powerful, the Boise testimony, which I got a chance to see, as you did hear people very bravely come forward and talk. In Sandpoint, and I think a lot of rural communities, the challenge to get up and speak, because by the nature there's just less people there, and so there's less people affected there because there's less people. makes it, I think, even bigger challenge, and we didn't see people come out and speak, but we did have a staff member from our city who came to every single meeting that we had on this, and I had no idea why she cared particularly about this. Frankly, she was a fairly conservative staff member, and I thought she might be there because she objected to the ordinance. And 3 months after I had left the city council, and about 6 months or 5 months after we passed it, we were having a gathering of some of the staff, and I were hanging out, and she came up to me and she said, "John, I just want you to know that this has transformed my life. This is my partner, and I never felt like I could be public before about this." She's in her 60s, and she said, "You know, for my whole life I've avoided going to weddings because I didn't want to be dishonest to my partner, but I also didn't want to, go and because I worried about the retribution that would happen to me and that I could lose my job, that there would be consequences to me." And this was someone who, who did not speak up during the process because she was afraid, even as we were going through it, even as votes started coming together, worrying that the consequences would be too hard, that she might lose housing, that she might lose her job. And that's the reality in rural communities around our state, is there are people who are hoping that communities will act, that are hoping the state will act. But they're afraid to speak out, and they're right, because discrimination can happen and does happen in Idaho. And so we need to reach out and be a safety net.
Thank you. And Maryanne, back to your role in pushing the enactment of the anti-discrimination measure. Among the objections raised at that point, how would you identify or characterize the principal objections to the passage of the measure?
The first thing I want to say is it was really interesting to me, compared to what I expected, how little opposition we saw. There were a few, and as the arguments tend to be in situations like this, some of them rather disturbing and vitriolic. But there was not a groundswell of opposition that one might have expected in a community the size of Boise. The arguments against primarily were religious in nature, that a person felt they somehow were equating non-discrimination with a necessity on their part to accept something that they apparently are not comfortable with. And that's a tough thing to break down. But the other point that I want to make that was so powerful, and it came up in some of the things that John said, is that when we held our hearing in November, our public hearing on this, and so many people came and told such poignant stories, and the courage of the people who came and told those stories with no legal protection, because this did not go into effect until the following January, and it was not retroactive. And when people can stand up and trust you that much and be that brave, the few in the back of the room with the ugly signs were marginalized very quickly in that hearing, and actually I could sit here and see them sort of trickle out. They didn't stay, they just went away, and that was a better way to have it transpire, I think.
Thank you. Occasionally, Reverend Glass, we hear expressions of concern by members of various religions about the impact of this measure on their religious liberty. Now, we've already noted here on this panel that the LDS Church championed the cause of anti-discrimination measures in Salt Lake City, and some 20 cities throughout the state of Utah have enacted those measures. So we know where the LDS Church stands. Let me ask you a question. How is it that you believe we can balance religious liberty with non-discrimination measures?
Sure. I believe there is actually no conflict between non-discrimination and religious liberty. My freedom to practice my religion does not include my ability to impose it on others. Let me give you an example. As a woman, I have equal rights under the law, right? I have the right to pay taxes, to vote, to speak, to have equal pay for equal work, or that's the theory, at least. But there are many religious organizations who would not allow me to speak in worship because I'm a woman and because of how they interpret a few verses of Scripture. The Catholic Church has the freedom, for example, to prevent me from being a priest. If non-discrimination legislation were intent on limiting religious freedom, then surely we'd have female priests in the Catholic Church and women speaking in pulpits across all religious traditions. And yet you find we do not actually have that because we in this country have the freedom to practice religion as we want, as long as it does not harm others. So non-discrimination legislation is necessary for religious freedom because we all need equal opportunity to worship God or to not worship God as the Spirit leads us. For some people, if that means women shouldn't speak and people who are gay and lesbian shouldn't be full participants, then they should be free within the walls of their buildings, as long as no one is harmed, to practice their faith as they choose. But it would not be religious liberty for one religious tradition to limit my right to worship, or yours, by imposing their particular interpretation of Scripture on my faith community. It is not religious liberty to allow one group of people to cause pain to another group of people in the workplace, in schools, or in the public square because of how they read the Bible. So my advocating for equal rights legislation is not actually to impose changes on how other faith communities practice. It is to allow people in Idaho the freedom to live as I live with the same rights that I have.
Thank you. Now, Pam, in your position with the Idaho Commission on Human Rights, you've already detailed the kinds of complaints that you handle. How would your office, or how would the commission be affected, if it's affected at all, by the passage of this proposed amendment?
That's a really good question, and it's always one that is looked at very carefully. In 2009, Senator Coyner asked me a very similar question as to how would this, passing this amendment impact us fiscally and if we would be able to handle it, because that's always a big consideration in Idaho when you're dealing with legislation and laws and all of that. Because sexual orientation and gender identity were not issues that were covered under our database, which we work through the EEOC, I did not have any way to answer the question. So consequently, we did a study for 1 year from 2009 to 2010. It was just sort of an independent tracking system that we created in our office so that we could see how something like this might impact Idaho. And during that period of time, we had about 21 people contact our office inquiring, about their issues of discrimination and alleging that they believed that they had been discriminated against on the job because of their sexual orientation or in housing or public accommodation. We did have one call where someone had been subjected to a hate crime, and that's one that we forwarded to the police department. Now, just to kind of go back a little bit, the Commission's processing of cases vary from year to year. The largest year that we had was in 2003, and we had 590 or 67 cases. Last year, we took in 491 cases. Regardless of whether we've got 567 or 491 cases, we are not going to raise the staff level. It's not going to impact any of the resources that we have at the Commission. So 21 cases would not have any fiscal impact on the Commission, and we anticipate that that would probably be about where we would start with those.
Thank you. Maryanne, just a little bit ago, mentioned the perception, at least, that Idaho has a very unfortunate reputation across the country as a safe haven for extremism. In your view, from the standpoint of participating in the business community, Clark and Kevin, what would the passage of this proposed amendment do to enhance the reputation of the state of Idaho as a better area to promote economic development and to lure industries to our state?
I've been traveling out of the state on business now for almost 20 years, and the current news always is the top conversation. And sometimes it's great. My preference is when it's focused around the blue football field, because that's usually positive. So I think that it's positive news, and we need positive news to combat the negative news that comes out of the state on a frequent basis.
And Clark, your thoughts?
I want to, Maryanne mentioned something that made me very proud personally and professionally, is that we have 110 investors that make up about, and it's a lot of money. They give us about $800,000 a year to do our job. We are the largest economic development agency in the state. When we were asked to help with the legislation in Boise, I had to take that to those 110 investors, business investors, and I had to take it to a board. It was unanimous that we supported. The Chamber of Commerce has over 2,000 businesses involved in the metro, inside the city boundaries and outside. Well, they took the Chamber of Commerce, Bill Connors took that to his executive committee as well as his larger committee. It was unanimous to support this. So business doesn't have a problem with supporting whatever we do in Idaho, and I think it's because they want to do the right thing. My experience has been on the road is that Arizona, when Arizona started talking about becoming their own country, and they had all the discrimination talk, and they were kind of, you know, having some policy issues with our president, they would talk about that. They would say, how are you guys doing on this discrimination, the immigration issue, and what are you guys doing over there? Are you? And I said, you know, we're number one, we're not on the border, but number two is there's not been a lot of talk about that. But does that bother you that they have a policy like that? And they said, it bothers us that it's unstable there, that we don't know what they will do next. And we're not going to go into a state where we cannot have predictable behavior. So when you talk about things like this that we have in front of us, it is about doing the right thing. It is about stability. It is about moving forward and being progressive in terms of rights, in terms of policy, in terms of what you're doing as a state, and does it make sense, and is it stable? That's what they're really worried about. They really don't, it's not the ideology that they're worried about. It's about the stability of your state. It's about the stability of your city that they're coming into. They want to make sure you're okay. Thank you.
And given that point, Clark, that in fact it's an important tool to recruit new businesses, given the fact that Sandpoint in the north and Boise have both enacted the measures, as well as Ketchum, and now in southeastern Idaho, Idaho Falls and Pocatello, and of course Twin Falls as well, are all strongly considering those measures. Does that mean, in your opinion, that the cities who have not passed these ordinances may not be viewed as such fertile ground to recruit other industries and businesses? Might they be left behind those cities that have already, in effect, indicated their commitment to the protection of human rights?
I would tell you that Kevin mentioned headlines. What I worry more about businesses that are looking to come into your area to grow to. They are reading your paper. They are following you online. I've had clients that have read my local paper better for a year before they called me than I have. So that's what you've got to worry about. So is it going to hurt them that they haven't passed the legislation? Not today. But if they get that headline, if it gets out there that there's a problem there, I guarantee you they will be X'd off the list of cities being considered before they ever know about it. They'll never get the phone call.
So as various cities contemplate the passage of these ordinances, and perhaps our legislature soon contemplates the passage of the protection against gender identity and sexual orientation, Kevin, in your view, would it represent a strong statement by the state of Idaho that in fact it is committed to protecting all people from discrimination, including sexual orientation and gender identity?
Would it send a strong message? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. As I said, you know, when I walk through my restaurant, I like to see a wide variety of customers in there, whether it be a suit and a tie. I mean, I like seeing the suit and the tie at this table, and that I'm not that thrilled with the facial jewelry, but, you know, if that's where they want to go, that's fine. And it's that when people come from out of state, they should know we're a hospitality industry. They should be comfortable. That's what's most important, and I think that's what this legislation could do for us.
And do you think, John, that the reasoning that you employed, and the same question will go for Maryanne, do you think that the reasoning you and your colleagues employed on the City Council should be reasoning embraced by legislators on both sides of the aisle when this measure is proposed?
Yeah, and I would just note, you know, the Human Rights Commission has endorsed the legislation, and that's a body appointed by a Republican governor. I mean, the idea that there are people already across political lines in the state who have signed on to this. The one place where it hasn't happened yet, and it started to in the past, was in the legislature. I would also note a former member of the Senate Majority Leadership sponsored this legislation previously. So there has been bipartisan support for this legislation, and my hope is there will be again.
Thank you. Maryanne?
I should know better than to leave my mic off. Yeah, I agree. I mean, the polls have shown that over 81% of Idahoans favor non-discrimination for sexual orientation and gender identity. And, you know, we seem to be stuck in this odd little rut lately in terms of public discourse about what laws we're going to follow and what laws we're not. And I don't know when we turned into a legal cafeteria, but it doesn't work that way. I mean, you know, we have laws, we follow the laws that are on the books. If you don't like the laws, you work to get them changed. And I think that the kind of conversations that we're having today, the power of the faith communities and the business communities coming to the table on this issue in such a big way gives us the opportunity to be able to parse these odd opposing arguments and to help people understand that they can be supportive of non-discrimination legislation, and it doesn't tie to anything else. It is simply the right thing to do. And so, you know, we have to just continue working at that. And I do think that we're making some progress, and I hope that, you know, it's hard to raise something every year and see it fail. But it would be worse to not raise it every year and just wonder what if. So it's got to keep coming up every year. And if it fails every year, then the people who did not support it, we know who we need to work with to educate. We know who needs to be held accountable for not being supportive, and we keep moving forward to the next year.
And you know, the popularity of these non-discrimination measures passed here in Boise and Sandpoint and elsewhere reflect the surveys, the statewide surveys that show that some 80% of Idahoans are opposed to the encroachment on the rights of Idahoans based on sexual orientation and gender identity. They don't think it's fair to fire people or to deny them housing based on those categories. So that same reasoning and that same experience becomes a statewide sentiment. And Clark, when you and Kevin point out that in fact the business communities are supportive because they recognize that it becomes a valuable economic tool, and John, when you and Maryanne point out that in fact you don't like to hear the sad stories raised by your own constituents who couldn't even bring to the attention of law enforcement officials that they've been the victims of crime for fear then that their statement of their sexual orientation or gender identity would be placed on the record. Those are all powerful arguments, are they not, to persuade the legislature to finally enact this measure? And Reverend Glass, you've been eloquent in your remarks about the views of those in the community of faith. What would you say to legislators if this room were crowded with legislators from both chambers? What would you say to them as a final point of appeal?
I think what I would say to them and to us all is that we have a great privilege in this country that the people who wrote our founding documents spoke about the common welfare. And they didn't just talk about everybody pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps and going their own way individually. They wrote, promote the general welfare as part of who we are. And we don't always live into that very well. I don't think our nation is doing such a hot job of living into that right now, for example. But I think it's a reminder to our better nature that that's who we can be. We can be the people who don't just care for how we do personally, but for how our neighbors are doing and how people we may not even know are able to thrive and to succeed. And I think that there's room within all religious traditions to understand that care of the neighbor and that concern for the stranger and that hospitality to the people who we may never meet. It goes deep through not just my religious tradition, but through all of them. This idea that we would care for people who we may not know personally. And it's what makes our nation great, and it's what, I think it's who we should remember that we want to be.
Thank you. And so let me give the other panelists an opportunity to take a minute or so to express their views and what they would like to say to legislators if, in fact, this room were crowded with legislators. Clark, please.
Do the next right thing.
John, please.
Well, I'm still a recovering politician, so I can't be that pithy. But
we'll give you extra time.
But I'll leave some for Maryanne on the other side too, because I know she'll need it as well. But what I would say to them is, America was founded on a promise of opportunity, and we haven't always lived up to that. Certain as Martin Luther King Jr. Day notes, it's an evolving promise that we've gotten better and better in keeping, and this is the next step in keeping that promise, is extending the same right to opportunity, this right to liberty, to another group of Americans who deserve it just as much as the groups that we've added in the past and need to continue to add to make the American dream truly as large as America is, and truly live up to that expectation and that dream.
Thank you. Pam, please.
Thank you. I would say that 44 years ago, this body was visionary in creating the Idaho Human Rights Act. They created language in the act so that we could continue to protect people as we went along. We've done that with people with disabilities. We've done that with people who have who are older workers, and we need to do it again until we're all protected. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Kevin, please.
I think from the employer standpoint, I look at this and say, well, the addition of these words is not going to impact my ability to let somebody go because they can't show up on time or because they're hostile to their coworkers or anything else. You have so many protections in today as an employee that this is the one little piece that's kind of missing, and it has nothing to do with whether they're nice or, at all. So to me, I think it's an easy addition that needs to be made.
Thank you very much. And Maryanne, please.
Well, if this room were full of legislators, the first thing I would say was thank you for showing up and engaging in this conversation. And to the ones, I don't mean to be caustic, I mean to the ones that are here, thank you, because you're the ones that will help us to get some of the points across that we're trying to make heard. And if we can do anything to help in the education process, please call on us to help you do that. I would encourage them to heed our conversations about public safety. And I would tell them that since our enactment of our ordinance, and I knock on wood when I say this, it went into effect on January 1st, and we have not had one complaint. But what we have had is people come to us and say, and Emily said this so eloquently at a council meeting last week, we woke up on January 1st and we felt safer in Boise. And I think we need to extend that feeling statewide.
Thank you. I'm mindful of the fact that we're almost out of time, and I'm told that another committee will be coming in about 1 o'clock. I'm sure they won't mind delaying the public's business so that we can continue. So let me say in conclusion that as we survey the course of American history, we recall that in many, many important ways that we're a country that has evolved in the protection of the rights and liberties of Americans. From a very slow start in which we practiced widespread discrimination against African Americans, against women, against Native Americans, we've moved across the centuries to expand constitutional protections to the point now where all Americans are protected except those who are not. And there's the opportunity now in the remaining cities here in Idaho to enact non-discrimination measures, but there's a much greater opportunity for the state legislature to extend protections to Idahoans all across the state. When we think about the long history of prejudice and discrimination in America, we recognize that those practices undermine the very possibility of democracy, because democracy is a system that rests on reasonableness, rests on the idea of reason, discussion, and debate, and expansiveness. And so there is before the legislature, or will be very shortly, the opportunity to remedy the inequities that still prevail here in the state of Idaho. I want to say again what a privilege it is for me to be able to moderate the panel and to extend my appreciation to Representative Burgoyne and to Senator Buckner-Webb for hosting this education panel on the Idaho Human Rights Act. And thank you all very much for joining us.
Just a couple of things before we go. I do want to say on behalf of Senator Buckner-Webb and myself how much we appreciate the panel and the moderator. I learned a great deal today, and I've probably not been working quite as hard on the issue over the last several years as some other people have, but I don't consider myself a novice with it either. So this was really a treat, and I really appreciate it. Secondly, I want to recognize former Senator LaFavor, who has given her all to this cause. Finally, I want to thank Senator Buckner-Webb and all of those that we announced at the beginning who have joined to make this panel discussion, I think, very successful. It's now incumbent upon us to go forward and to engage with the legislators in the remainder of this session and see what we can accomplish. And I know that with all of your help, we can accomplish a great deal. I am very optimistic. It can't come soon enough. It can't happen soon enough. Justice delayed is justice denied. But we all, and I've been so proud of this movement because it's been respectful. It has been democratic. It has sought to persuade, not to bludgeon, not to threaten. It has sought to do the very best things that we do as Americans, which is to show the way. And that's why I'm very proud to be a part of your movement. Thank you.